you can count on Adrian. With Adrian Hill.
Hello everyone, this is Adrian Hill from Canada, and today I have a really special guest with me, a fellow Canadian from Montreal, Johnathan Jarry. Johnathan is a science communicator for McGill University's Office for Science and Society, or the OSS, and the co-host of the award-winning Body of Evidence podcast, which I highly recommend you check out if you haven't already done so. He is frequently quoted in local, national, and international media on issues of science and pseudoscience, and is a regular on CTV Montreal news. His subversive video about a fake cancer cure went viral and reminded over 14 million people to be skeptical. And Johnathan has been interviewed on the Skeptic Zone before on episode number 569 in 2019 about the dangers of ear candling. Johnathan Jarry, welcome back to the Skeptic Zone.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, that was in the before times. I do remember speaking to Richard, but it feels like so long ago.
It does, doesn't it? It feels like another century.
Indeed.
And to start things off, I would actually like to know a little bit about your story. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? For example, when did you first become interested, particularly in science, and then maybe follow that with science communication?
Oh, wow. I guess, my background is in molecular biology and human genetics, and I became interested in that. I think what comes to mind is when I was in high school, a friend of mine discovered genetics and brought a book with him to lunch, and he was talking about RNA and proteins and messenger RNA and transfer RNA and DNA and all that kind of stuff. And it felt like discovering a completely new world that I was not aware of because at the time, genetics was not something that was taught in high school. It was still, it was very advanced. And so he had just discovered this. And so that kind of, piqued my curiosity. And also when I went to university, the show CSI had started. So I became interested in using DNA evidence for human identification purposes. So I worked briefly in forensics, and so that's kind of what led me down this road of learning about DNA and how it's transmitted and how proteins are made and mutations. And so I've worked in a lot of related fields. I've worked in a clinical laboratory where we were using DNA testing to give doctors information on cancer patients and their tumors, and if they would respond to this drug versus that drug, and looking at prognostic markers as well. I've also worked in forensic biology, as I mentioned, low vision rehabilitation research, and I've been doing science communication for perhaps a decade now, something like that. And I've been doing it as a career for, again, my perception of time has been warped by COVID, but something like 5.5 years at McGill, where we have a very unique office that is dedicated to separating sense from nonsense for the public.
Yeah, it's a great thing. I wish we had it all across Canada, because I think it's
all across the world. Think bigger.
Yes,
I mean, but the issue is always funding, right? The issue is always, well, who's going to fund something like this? Everybody realizes we need people to fight back against misinformation and against pseudoscience, but nobody, very, very, very few people want to fund these efforts, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. So which specific universities, you mentioned some of your science background in biology, which specific universities did you actually attend?
So I got my bachelor's from McGill, I got my master's degree from the University of Montreal, and I also worked at the University of Montreal in low vision rehabilitation research, and now I'm back at McGill. And then when I was in low vision, we also had some ties to Concordia University. So we have 4 universities in Montreal, and I've either worked in or had colleagues from or studied at 3 of the 4 universities. So I've almost got a full bingo card at this point.
That's awesome. I understand you didn't finish a PhD. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why you didn't finish it? Was there a reason for that?
Yes, there's always a reason for something like that. And I'm part of a legacy of people who have started graduate studies and didn't finish them. I mean, I did finish my master's, but then when I went back to do a PhD, I did abandon it after 3 years. I passed my pre-doc exam. I was doing well, but the issue was, and it really triggered me starting to do science communication and why I do science communication, which is that I started to notice issues with how scientific research was being done. I noticed, we had, I was part of the sort of the early-ish days of big data in molecular biology and genetics, where researchers now look at the entire genome or the entirety of the messenger RNAs that we have, the transcriptome, or the entirety of the proteins that we have. And that's a lot of data. And because of chance events, you can find false positive results very easily if you're not careful. And I started to see this again and again in the work that I was doing and the work that other students in neighboring labs were doing. And I started to see how it became easy for researchers to cut corners and to, basically analyze data in a way that it was not as rigorous as it should be, because there are incentives in the system of scientific research.
Right. And
there were 2 lectures that I attended during my PhD that really changed or kind of solidified what I was thinking about these things. One of them was, ironically, from Dr. Johnathan, who before the pandemic was very respected and now has become a sort of COVID minimizer. But he was presenting, for example, the work that he did on food stuff and cancer risk, where he and a colleague looked through the scientific literature to see how many studies were showing that tomatoes cause cancer versus decrease your risk of cancer, and milk and cereals and things of that nature, showing that these studies are all over the place. And that led me to start doing science communication on the side, because I really wanted the public to have an accurate perception of what science could deliver, which is that, we tend to put science up on a pedestal, and it is the best tool that we have to understand the world around us. But it is, at the end of the day, it remains a human activity. And so there is corruption, and there are bad incentives in the system, and there's corner cutting. There's all of these things. And it is important to understand how messy scientific research can be in practice, so that when we see results on, being spread on Facebook, on Twitter,
or in the news,
we can have a better... Or the news, yes, especially, so that we can have the right frame of mind with which to think of these results.
I understand your approach to scientific skepticism has changed. And if so, can you explain how and why?
I think many of us who get into skepticism, we go through a phase that is not unlike adolescence, where we relish being the balloon poppers and saying, oh, that thing you believe in, it's BS, and here's why. And this thing you just said, that's a logical fallacy, and here's its name. And it's something that I've come to refer to as drive-by skepticism, where, there's a conversation happening online, and then somebody comes in and goes, that's a Dunning-Kruger effect, and they just drive away, and they feel like they've accomplished something. So, I went through a similar phase where I thought of skepticism in these very, very, very narrow ways, with no consideration to human psychology, no consideration to empathy, no consideration to persuasion, because I care about changing people's minds. If somebody has a false belief that is causing harm, I would like for them to change their belief. But if I treat them like they're stupid, they're unlikely to do that. Yeah. So I believe that I've become more empathetic and more compassionate in my skepticism over the years. And I've tried in my writing also to be more compassionate and to not sound like a butthole, essentially. And there are limits to that, because whenever you are traipsing over somebody's very deeply held beliefs, there are people who will still accuse you of being closed-minded and being arrogant. That is bound to happen. So there is this problem of sort of limitless empathy that is required from some people. But overall, I would say that you do reach more people when you're being kind than when you're just being very kind of adolescent and you're thinking about skepticism.
Yeah, and I saw that. I got into skepticism because of my kids, basically. They were the ones that even pointed out that there was such a thing. My oldest son was exactly like what you were saying. He would say to me, Mom, that's a logical fallacy. Mom, that's this. Mom, that's confirmation bias.
Right.
But speaking of my son, I am a GSOW editor, or Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia editor, under the leadership of our friend Susan Gerbuck, who says hi.
Hello, Susan.
And my eldest son actually said to me once I got involved in the project, and he has leveled out. He doesn't do all the the same things.
He's mellowed out.
He's done that. He's gone through that adolescent stage you talked about. Right. He has mellowed out. And one of the things he stated to me was that the GSOW project is one of the most important things we can do as activists. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think it's an important thing to do? Or are there other things that we could be doing?
I think it's very important in the sense that Wikipedia is one of the most visited websites there is. And so if you have the choice between starting something brand new and hoping to attract an audience or going to where everybody is going and making a difference there, it makes absolute sense to focus on a website like Wikipedia. Absolutely.
It would be nice if more people did become active. Can you suggest some ways that people can become active, obviously besides the Wikipedia project that I just discussed?
Just sharing good information among your social networks is already a good place to start. I mean, we saw during the pandemic this tsunami of misinformation, and people like me can't reach everyone. You know, we do well with the articles that I write for McGill. I have a podcast. I'm also in the media a lot. I'm on TV pretty much every week, and that's great. But I still can't reach everyone, and nobody who is sort of public facing in skepticism can reach everyone. And the thing is that, you have friends and you have colleagues and you have relatives that I don't know, but if you share the work that I do and the work that other people in skepticism do and the work that good scientists are doing within your own circles, that is great because that you're reaching people that the rest of us can't reach directly. So just that is already good. Something else that I've said a few years ago in a talk that I was giving is that I think journalists overall have become better at covering science, but there's still some really bad, very frothy, fluffy kind of coverage, and it's easy to just tag the journalist on social media and be like, this is a piece of trash, But if you want that journalist to learn something, then you may want to reach out to them in an email, for example, and say, hey, I read your article about this thing. What you may not have been aware of is that actually the science shows that blah, blah, blah. And here are a few papers. And if you portray the situation in this way, it can cause harm. And, feel free to reach out to me some more if you want to. I'm part of a local skeptic group, blah, blah, blah. That can make a difference. I mean, it did for me a few years ago. There was a journalist here who had written a piece that was had a lot of false balance about the use of vitamin C injections in cancer patients. And I reached out to this person, and that led to another piece that she wrote with my collaboration. And hopefully that sort of gave her a more scientific perspective on these issues. Because a lot of wellness trends, they tend to be portrayed as almost like human interest stories, or almost like covered like fashion. And sometimes journalists don't realize that, no, there's science there that is being ignored, and that's important to point out.
And it can be harmful. And that goes back to treating people with respect again, instead of lashing out, and you'll be heard more likely.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that brings me to the video, This Natural Trick Can Cure Your Cancer. And I believe it was 5 years ago that you released that. And that was terrific. And I actually remember...
In another life.
In another life, yeah. And I remember sharing it with people. I thought that was amazing. I'm kind of wondering, first of all, did you try to measure the impact of that? Was there a measurable impact? And is there a reason why you haven't released more of those? Because I thought humor is another way of catching people, right? I loved it.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, I made a video that we released through a lot of different accounts, and that was about 5 years ago. And it was this 1 minute video that was about this hidden cancer cure, this moss that some old white dude had discovered could cure cancer. But you wouldn't know it because Big Pharma doesn't like this. And then halfway through the video, I showed that actually everything that you've seen so far is a lie. And there are clues that you should have picked up on along the way. And it became a reminder to people to be alert when they're online and to not simply believe a video just because it's got, flashy visuals and music and whatnot. We reached over 14 million people with that video. I did over 30 media interviews. I was in New York City when it kind of exploded, and I had to go to a studio in Manhattan to shoot a few interviews back home. I did an interview in Australia. I was not physically in Australia, but I was here in Montreal, and then it was an Australian breakfast show. It was very, very interesting. However, afterwards came COVID, and we saw all the misinformation and people who believed it. All that to say that my video did not change the world.
Yeah.
I think, all of these little things, they do add up and they can make a difference, but it's not going to solve the issue of false beliefs and misinformation and pseudoscience. And it's to your question of, how can we measure its impact? We can't really. It's a question that I've asked a very popular science YouTuber many years ago. And it's the same issue that, you can see the reach in numbers. You can get some feedback from people, but ultimately you don't know. You don't even know if people got the right lesson from the video than that you would have expected. So it's very hard. This is the idea that I've had that maybe YouTube for educational videos should give the option to content creators to put up a quiz after their video. And then you fill out the quiz to see if you've actually learned something from that video. Right. So I don't know if that's something that would ever be deployed, but that would be interesting from the perspective of an educator who's on YouTube to see, okay, have they learned the right thing? Because just because you think that you've explained it well and because your audience believes it has understood the right message does not mean that any kind of actual teaching has occurred.
Right, exactly. And as a teacher, I certainly understand that. Is there a reason you haven't, is that the main reason you haven't done another one? I guess it's a lot of work.
Well, it's, this video had a certain cleverness to it in a sense that it's not always easy to come up with these ideas that are going to go viral. I mean, first of all, you can't predict virality. Right. We got lucky, we're at the right time at the right place, and it just worked. But it's very hard to try and reproduce that and make another quote unquote viral video because the next one might be a complete dud. It's hard to do.
Listening to your podcast, I understand that sometimes you get a little frustrated with the skeptical movement in Canada and the US and maybe the world. Your podcast co-host, Christopher Labos, he jokingly says you rip up your skeptical card again. You say that. Can you expand on that?
I think, there are issues with the skeptical movement as a whole. I think one of the issues is some of the leading figures have gotten fairly old, which is, what biologically happens, but also it means that there's a certain conservatism that sometimes happens in terms of ideas. There's also a lot of, here's that dead horse that we're beating again. And, sometimes there are a lot of interesting things that invite a skeptical look that get pushed aside because we stick within what feels familiar, what feels comfortable. And it's, especially in the work that I do at McGill, I do cover the anti-vaccine movement, for example. There are things that are still very much important, but I do try to go outside of that as much as I can. So, there's that, and there's the teenage skepticism that I was mentioning earlier of feeling like pointing out a logical fallacy is the end of the journey. So, yeah, and I would like to see more done, and it's difficult because we are an underfunded movement. I mean, it's not just offices like ours at McGill, but it's also just a movement of skepticism as a whole. It doesn't get the kind of money that religions get, for example. So it's hard. It is hard.
I've noticed the aging thing myself. I mean, I'm aging. I didn't really get into this until I retired, and I think that's quite common. Most of us can't have it as a full-time job like you can. We're just volunteers that do our best.
Yes, exactly. And it becomes hard to reach a younger crowd. I mean, when I've been to American skeptic conferences, the demographics are skewing very old and very white. And so if we're trying to get the next generation interested in this, we have to think outside of our usual box.
Okay, this is something I just thought of just off the top of my head. Have organizations such as the OSS trying to get the critical thinking into school system curriculum? How hard would that be?
Very hard, but not impossible. So this is something that's always at the back of my head, and I hope that one day I can have the time to fully invest to look at the situation here and what could be done. I know that it's been done elsewhere. I believe that Massimo Polidoro has spoken about how they've achieved this in Italy in some way. I remember somebody else from Toronto, I believe, who's been running not clinical trials, but randomized trials on these kinds of interventions in school-aged children. Christopher DiCarlo, perhaps. There have been a few examples that I've seen over the years, and I'm also aware of some teachers and professors who have managed to create a course in something like this. There is one here in Montreal that I know who, so he teaches at what is sort of a junior college in Quebec. We have a strange educational system, but it's between high school and university. He has created an optional course in critical thinking that people can take, where they go over all the basics and sort of, the Yeti and UFOs and ghost hunting and logical fallacies and things of that nature. So it has been done here and there, but the problem when you're trying to add something to a curriculum is always, well, what do you take out? Because the curriculum is full.
Yes, yeah.
And from the little that I know of this, I think they've been trying more to introduce critical thinking in every class, as opposed to having one course that is dedicated to it. And has it been working? Is this being evaluated? Do we have data on this? I have no idea. But your idea is a very good idea. I know that it's been done here and there sporadically, but how to do this on a larger scale, I don't quite know what the answer is.
So what is up next for you? Have you got plans for something new or continuing what you're doing?
Pretty much continuing what I'm doing. It's already challenging enough because I do write a lot about, and also on the podcast, we talk a lot about bad science. And you don't want the public to become, cynical of science because you keep focusing on the stuff that doesn't work or that has been poorly analyzed. We just published a piece on the Hawthorne effect, which was a fascinating dive into the history of that, because it's one of those things like the Dunning-Kruger effect that skeptics like to plaster over things. Oh, this thing over there. Oh, yes, it has a name. It's a scientific effect that we know very well. Boom, that's what it is. And we tend not to go back to the primary sources to see, is this effect even real? Has there been criticism of it in the scientific literature? It just becomes part of the gospel of skepticism. And I know that a lot of skeptics, they don't like accusations of scientism and of dogmatic thinking because they think that, no, we're all these critical thinkers. But very few of us go back to the primary literature on some of these psychological effects. And I did a bunch of articles about this maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. And I was really shocked to find out how little data there was on some of these effects that we like to prop up and say, yes, this is a true thing. Psychologists know about this. Well, this was done in 20 undergrads in California. So how generalizable is this? I don't know. The Hawthorne effect is this idea that when you're a part of a study, you behave differently because you're being observed. But even that is not the full definition. There are different definitions of it depending on who tells a story. And then what actually happened at the Hawthorne works in the 1920s and 30s is a fascinating history. There's a whole socio-political undertone that never gets mentioned. There were women workers who were accused of being Bolshevik and of having anemia that gave them psychopathology. I mean, it's a crazy story, but then that gets sanitized over time, and it becomes this thing of, oh, well, women work harder when stuff is happening around them, and it gets put into textbooks. And so I will continue doing the work that I do because it's not just about informing the public on these really interesting scientific issues, but also even just skeptics and science communicators who may have taken some things for granted. And now I'm coming along saying, well, I've been questioning this. Let's look a bit more deeply into this. Is this something that we should be saying? Maybe not. Maybe the Hawthorne effect is not really a thing that we should be saying anymore.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, it's a good point. It reminds me of the whole marshmallow test thing that happened. Yep. And I remember as a teacher being taught on professional development about delaying gratification and how the success is related to that. And I saw it several times over the years. It wasn't just once at one professional development day. And then they come out with, well, the study had flaws. That's exactly the problem, right? Going back and looking at that study.
The Superman power pose, and there are a lot of these like very flashy, sexy studies, or sometimes there are these very old classic experiments that seem to reveal so much about human nature, and they become they're written about in textbooks, and people learn them in their first year as students. And it's just taken for granted. But when you actually go back, you go, oh, wait a second. This is a lot more complex than it looked. And maybe it's not even true.
Exactly. Yeah.
So skepticism of science itself can be good as long as it's done in a healthy way.
Exactly. So this has been really great talking to you, Johnathan. But how can people find you in your work if they haven't already done so?
So the work that I do for McGill can be found at mcgill.ca/OSS, not just my work, but the work of everybody who works at the office. The podcast that I co-host is called The Body of Evidence. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. I do have a personal website, which is just myfullname.com. It's mostly there for journalists who want to get an idea of who I am and what I've done. And I'm still on Twitter for now, at Cracked Science, although the website was misbehaving this morning. So who knows? It feels like the Titanic and it's slowly sinking. And at some point, I'll have to jump ship. But I'm still on Twitter for now.
Well, it sounds good. So, and I'm sure Richard will make sure to include all those links in the show notes below. So check them out. And what a pleasure it's been to talk to you today. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope we get to talk again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Until next time, this is Adrienne Hill signing off.